Welcome to section 11.1. Now in this section I want to focus on some disorders that we tend to find in humans. So these will be where you have a bad version, we'll say, of a particular allele for a particular gene. And based on this, you're typically disadvantaged in some way. It can be up to and including death, but it can also be more minor. We're also going to talk about some of the ways we can try and track, detect, and predict whether or not offspring or even some of your ancestors would have had some of these disorders and what that means. So that way we can try and use some low-tech ways of figuring out if your children are at risk of getting some of these disorders. So starting off, pretty much all the disorders we talk about, with a few exceptions, are going to be recessive. And there's a good reason for this, because recessive genes can hide. You can be a heterozygote, what we call a carrier, where you have the allele, so I can pass on the allele for this particular negative thing, but I don't actually show it phenotypically. So I'm still healthy, but I could have an offspring that's not. This is kind of like with Mendel when his F1s were all heterozygotes. None of them had that phenotype. We could say short or white flowers, but if two of those heterozygotes mate, there's a 1 in 4 chance that the offspring will have that recessive condition, which can be something that's negative up to and including the idea of death itself. So looking at some of these traits, many of these will be kind of specific to certain groups, because you'll see certain groups will be more likely to have more carriers. In certain populations, you'll see that some recessive negative alleles are just more common. So cystic fibrosis tends to be more of a European disease. This is one that affects quite a number of people, specifically of European descent. And so in this case, it's going to be where there's a faulty chloride receptor that's in your cell membranes, and it leads to a buildup of mucus in your digestive tract and in your lungs, your respiratory system. And this tends to lead to infection. It leads to your lungs not functioning properly. It leads to poor digestion. So this used to mean that you died anywhere from your teens to probably like your late 20s. Nowadays, with treatment, you can live a lot longer, but it's still a disorder that's going to require a lot of work on your part. It's not going to be fun, and it's likely going to lead to an early death. Now, because this is recessive, you'll see that most cases of someone getting this are going to be individuals that are heterozygous crossed with another individual who's also heterozygous. And based on that, we've talked about this idea that there is a 1 in 4 chance that you will get this homozygous recessive condition. There's a 2 in 4 chance, if you do the Punnett square, that you'll be a carrier yourself. So you're still at risk of passing it on to your children, even though you don't have it. And then there'd be a 1 in 4 chance in this particular cross here that's most common, at least amongst people that get it, or have a chance at getting it, that you would be homozygous dominant, which means your kids can never get it. So this is kind of what you see in many groups that aren't European, which means there's no chance, even if they were to mate with a carrier, that their offspring could be affected. Now, another disorder you see that actually is probably most common, I believe, in certain parts of Africa is going to be albinism. And so this is a gene that shuts off the ability for you to produce pigments. Specifically, you get this in the eye, you get this in the hair, you get this in your skin, and so you lack coloration. This is why sometimes they'll say red eyes are the sign of an albino, because you can see the blood, because there's not the additional pigment to mask it that's blue or green or brown. Your skin obviously looks to be kind of whitish, and your hair looks whitish, clearish, because it lacks that pigment. This can be a problem because you can get sun damage, which can be painful, lead to cancer. They tend to also have eyesight problems, so they can be blind or just have a lot of difficulty seeing. And once again, their eyes are very vulnerable to damage from sunlight. And so this is not a condition that typically is good. Even in the wild, if you talk about a lot of animals that suffer from albinism, this can be very negative because they tend to stand out, and so they lose their camouflage. So this will be another recessive condition. Now, galactosemia is going to be an inability to properly break down galactose, which is a type of monosaccharide. So individuals that eat galactose that have this condition have where it builds up, and it starts to lead to mental disabilities, and it can damage your liver, and it can damage your kidneys, up to and including leading to death. And so for these individuals, they have to make sure that they don't eat a diet that has galactose in it, which includes not eating lactose, because lactose is just a glucose and a galactose stuck together. It's a disaccharide. And so if you eat lactose, when it gets broken down, you're then exposed to the galactose, which then causes problems. This is one of those metabolic disorders where if you don't treat it properly, it causes severe damage. But if you know ahead of time that the individual has this, you can regulate their diet and oftentimes mitigate the effects. And lastly, we're going to talk about Tay-Sachs. Now, this one's found primarily amongst certain Jewish populations. This one is a lipid metabolic disorder where they do not properly process a lipid in the brain. It then builds up, becomes toxic, and it leads to death. So children that have Tay-Sachs typically are only going to live to be somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 3, 4, 5 years old. They tend to look very old along the way because it does some damage to their body. So you'll see that their heads are oftentimes bald. They'll look a little bit more wrinkly. So they look a little bit more like older individuals even at that point. So this is certainly not a fun disease, and it is fatal at an early age. So amongst those that are of Jewish descent, there's oftentimes registries where you can check to try to make sure that you're not a carrier as well as your spouse. And if you are, then you've got to make those decisions about whether or not you want to reproduce, knowing that if you're both carriers, just like we talked about, there's a 1 in 4 chance your child will have it. And if you're both carriers, there's a fairly high chance that you will have children that, even if they don't have it, will also be carriers. Now, I know we talked about that most disorders are going to be recessive, but there are some disorders that are dominant. The caveat for this is it's not going to be common simply because most individuals that have really bad dominant disorders, they die or don't reproduce because of it. And if they die or don't reproduce, that dominant can't hide. So if that individual dies, it takes that dominant allele with it, and now it's gone. So a lot of these mutations that lead to dominant disorders take themselves out of the gene pool in the same generation that they showed up. So they don't stick around, if you will. Now, there are some exceptions because some particular disorders don't affect an individual either A, enough to prevent them from reproducing, or B, they affect them after they've already done reproduction. So achondroplasia is a type of dwarfism where you don't grow the really long arms and legs. Instead, what happens is the cartilaginous growth plates seize up. And so you have a relatively normal-sized torso and head, although your torso and head will appear larger because your arms and legs stop growing. So this is one of the common types of dwarfism. But barring some slightly increased health issues, you can still live a pretty normal life. You can still have kids. And so because of this, it's able to be passed on. So if you've watched like Little People, Big World, and so they were still able to have children, and it's kind of cool that because they have this dominant disorder, and so they essentially are big little in most cases because typically at least one parent was normal size originally. So you'll see that both of them were heterozygotes, which also allowed for them to have a child that was normal height. So because this is a dominant disorder, you can have the normal size, which is also the most common allele, can be hiding. So two dwarfs could have a child, and that child can actually be normal height and not suffer from achondroplasia. For a child to have achondroplasia, one of the parents must have it unless it's a brand new mutation, which would be rare. The other disorder we'll talk about is one that ultimately doesn't impact your ability to reproduce, but still does a lot of damage. Like achondroplasia still has its effects early on, it's just the effects aren't so severe you can't reproduce. But with Huntington's, this is one where your nervous system starts to basically break down. And so you start to lose your motor skills and you start to kind of lose your mind. If you watch House, this is what 13 was worried about having. Now the issue with Huntington's is it doesn't tend to develop until you're more like 35, 45, maybe even 50 years old. And so because of this, you've typically went through, reproduced, you've done all this stuff. And then as you start to age, it'll just start to creep up and hit you. And so it's more like a time bomb. But because you've already reproduced, you're still able to pass it on. You know, it's kind of too late that you start to realize what's going on. This is also why, as shown in House, this can be difficult because if a parent has Huntington's, there's usually a 50-50 chance that you'll have it because the parent's usually a carrier. So there's a 50% chance they'll give you the dominant allele, 50% they give you the recessive. So seeing as usually only one parent has this, if one parent suffers, there's a 50% chance that you'll have it, and you can get tested to see if you have it. Now, a lot of people don't want to get tested because they don't want to know. You know, you don't want to know exactly how you're going to die or necessarily when. But if you get the testing, you know, usually somewhere between 35 and 45 years of age, you're going to start deteriorating, and ultimately you're going to die from this particular disease. So Huntington, this one works by just being delayed onset.